with there you go.
Sorry. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the Connect Machines and IoT using the device auth flow. We'll be starting in a few minutes, but for now, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay in the Slack channel, GitHub Universe 2020 Ecosystem Workshop 1. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. We're about to start the presentation. Before I hand it over to the presenter, there's a few things I'd like to cover. First off, if you haven't already, please take a peek at our code of conduct, pasting that information now. Your chat moderators are myself at Jovel, Juan as J Pemberty, Mark as Terabyte, and Sean as Sean Feldman. Moderators, please give a wave in the Slack channel. I hope all of our attendees are in the Slack channel now. Thank you, moderators. Moderators are here to answer your questions, especially during the coding segment. Please thread your conversations if possible. I will also post and pin links in the Slack channel that the speakers mentioned throughout the presentation for easy access. And if you have any questions for the speakers or would like for the speakers to go over something one more time, just mention me at Javel with your question, and I will ask them. I will ask the speakers during breaks in the presentation. Next up, code spaces. You have the option to do the coding exercises using CodeSpace or your local dev setup. CodeSpaces is currently in beta and requires a sign up. So if you're interested, please DM at Sean Feldman, your GitHub handle, and he will try and get you enabled during the workshop. This might not happen in time for the coding segment, but this workshop is being recorded and will be available soon after this session is over. If you don't get CodeSpace now, you can try the exercise after everything is set up in your account. And finally, if you have further questions after the workshop, some of us will keep an eye on this Slack channel for the next few days, and we'll try to answer your questions. And with that, I'd like to hand this over to our lovely speakers, Heather and Jake.
Hello. I will be sharing my slides now. Hello. And there we are. Welcome to our workshop today, Connect Machines and Internet of Things using the OAuth device flow. We are your hosts today. I am Heather Harvey. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an engineer on the Github Apps team.
And I'm Jake Wilkins. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm also an engineer on the GitHub Apps team. And I know Jovel just introduced him, but we have a handful of great moderators available in Slack to help you troubleshoot any problems you might have, answer any questions, or relay them on to us to pass along, and just generally make sure the whole workshop runs smoothly.
And awesome. So here's what we will be working on today. First, we'll show an overview of what GitHub apps are and how they work. We'll create a GitHub app and authenticate it with the OAuth device flow, and then use a newly minted app to create an issue on GitHub. And to show you what the OAuth device flow is and why you may want to use it, I'll hand it over to Jake for a live demo.
Awesome. Hopefully you can see my screen now. We're going to really just kick it off, testing all of our luck with a couple of live demos. The first one I have is CLI that we're going to authenticate. If you're not familiar with the device flow, it's really great for authenticating things that don't have ready access to a browser or a keyboard or something like that. From a flow perspective, a technical flow perspective, it begins with a request to GitHub saying, hey, we're going to walk a user through this device flow. And that's a simple post request. It looks like this. You just have to pass along the client ID. And don't worry about looking at any of these requests or URLs too carefully. We're going to be covering this in the workshop today. So if you make that request, it gives you this response, which gives you a handful of things that this device is going to need to walk through the rest of the flow. You can see we have a device code and a user code. And the first thing that this device needs to do with this information is set up a poll loop saying, hey, GitHub, has this user walked through this flow yet? And we're going to do that like this. It's just another post request passing along that device code. And you can see here that the response that we initially get is an error for authorization pending. That's because I haven't entered the code yet. So I'm going to go ahead and do that here in this tab, just by copy and pasting for this demo, and click continue. Now that we know what app we're trying to authorize, GitHub's going to say, hey, Jake, do you want to authorize this app? I'm going to say yes, because this is the presentation we're doing. and the response changes, and we get an access token. And this access token is the same sort of access token that you would get if you had walked through the traditional Webflow. You can use it with all of our APIs in the same way you would. And so that's a CLI demo. But like I said, the device flow is for clients that don't have ready access to a browser, something like a Raspberry Pi. So for a second demo, we're going to do, I built this button just to sort of showcase the power of the device flow and authenticating these sorts of low power devices. And so what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the device flow using this Raspberry Pi. And this is the exact same flow that we just walked through. So my Raspberry Pi is prompting me to enter a code, and I'm going to do that 4B80 and continue. This is a project I've been working on. My team, the apps team, we ship a lot of code, which means we review a lot of code. This looks good. I'm going to go ahead and authorize it. And it can be sort of exhausting. It says, you can see the device says I've authenticated. We've got that successful access token response. So I wanted to build a button that might make that flow a little bit easier. So I've got a PR here from Heather on our workshop repo. It looks like she's adding some slides. These are the slides for our workshop that you'll be able to view later on. And this looks good to me. So I'm going to go ahead and press my button here and approve it. Awesome. That worked. We've survived the test of the demo gods. And to sort of go over more of what just happened, more device flow in depth, and more information about GitHub Apps, I'm going to pass it back over to Heather, and we're going to keep going.
Yeah. So before we go on, are there any questions about the setup of the workshop? Moderators or anything in the chat? We are good to keep going. All right. Awesome. So first, what are GitHub Apps? GitHub Apps are the newest and best way to build on top of GitHub. We built them specifically to offer users and integrators more control over the permissions and accesses they grant each other. We also aim for more transparency into user identity by providing multiple ways for apps to authenticate requests. We also provide token exploration and better weight limiting for the most secure way to integrate on GitHub.
Basically, security.
Exactly. And to enable multiple identities for GitHub Apps, we have two ways to authenticate.
We have those two ways are server to server and user to server. And server to server is the app interacting with the API as the app itself. Like Heather said, we built GitHub Apps to be first-class actors within GitHub, meaning that apps can do things like author commits, create pull requests, make comments, and like we just saw, approve a pull request. Here we have a excellent screenshot of an app creating an issue, and you can see that both the issue and the issue comment are marked, they're displayed as authored by the app itself.
User to server, on the other hand, lets the bot assume the user's identity. And so the actions you take with the user to server authentication are attributed to the user.
Wait a second, it takes the user's identity?
Well, not exactly. As you can see here, this issue was opened by Jake via an app. And so both the user, Jake Wilkins, and the app, the presentation app, appear in line together.
User to server requests, they take a cross section of what everything that the app has access to and everything that the user has access to. So what we mean by access, on the left-hand side, that represents everything that the app is installed on. So resources like repositories and issues and PRs associated to that, those require an installation for an app to access it. And on the other side, we have everything that the user is granted access to through typical GitHub access controls. So if they're a member of an organization, things like that. And whenever we make a user to server request, we take both sides of that. And that request only has access to resources that both of those conditions are true for. To put it all together, server-to-server authentication just requires an installation. So that means that the app has been granted access. But user-to-server authentication requires that the user go through the additional authorization step. If you're making a request via user-to-server auth that interacts with a resource like a repo, you're also required to have an installation for that. This seems like a great place to check with our moderators to see if there are any questions about GitHub apps or authentication types. All right, I'm getting a thumbs up.
Looks like we're good. So next, let's talk about user authorization flows. And now we have two ways to do this. We have the traditional web flow, where you get redirected to a page like this from within your browser. And after authorizing, you get redirected back to the GitHub app itself. Here, the Slack app by GitHub, once you authorize, will redirect to slack.github.com.
And the next is the newly released device flow that we had a demo of earlier. You saw earlier that it can authorize like devices that don't have access for keyboard, browser, things like that. It works by using an 8-digit code to associate the user's browser session to a given device. And that screenshot on the next slide shows what that looks like, just entering into that screen there. And in IETF terms, it looks like this. This is what the first demo was sort of demonstrating, just sort of walking through this whole process. I'm not super great with these diagrams, but you know, we saw in the demo that it starts with step A and B is the device reaching out to the authorization server, in this case GitHub, saying, hey, let's get a code and a user code. The device starts this polling loop where we repeatedly request to GitHub, hey, has this user entered this code? And meanwhile, the user enters this code and authorizes the app to make these requests. And once that's finished, we get an access token and an optional refresh token. And I think that takes us to the end of our slides. Before we get started coding, let's check again if there are any questions about the device flow so far.
Yes, we actually have a question. How does the device authorization flow work if you have a second two-factor set, 2FA set?
If you have a second, a 2FA set, I believe GitHub will prompt you for that during the authorization step. So when the user gets to the browser and they enter the code, that's where GitHub will request that. I believe that to be true, but our moderators are sort of, especially at Terabyte, is a subject matter expert in this field. So if he has a better answer, feel free to chime in.
So is it a good idea to not set 2FA for device flow?
I don't think that's, no, I don't think that I would make that suggestion. I think it should flow just fine. I know, for example, our SAML auth, that works just as you would expect whenever you're authorizing the device.
Awesome. Are you ready to start getting set up? The first thing we're doing, we're not actually going to go straight to coding. We're going to be doing some setup on GitHub. But I'm going to have some specific tabs open that I encourage you to follow along with. The moderators will also be putting these links in the channel. But this first one here is a workshop repository. Hopefully you've seen it before. This is GitHub Universe Workshops / GitHub App Device Flow. And it'll have a lot of good resources for us to be using throughout this workshop. This next slide, next browser tab I'm going to have open is I'm going to go to my GitHub account. I'm going to go over to my profile. And if you see here, this A repo that I have is a repository that I'm going to be using for the workshop to be creating issues on with my app. If you don't feel like you have a repository that you're comfortable opening issues on with an app, go over to repositories and open a new one right now, real quick. But for right now, I'm just going to keep this repository open in my second tab. The next tab I'm going to go to, and the last one, is going to be github.com/settings/apps. If you want to see how to get via the UI, you can go to Settings underneath your profile. Underneath this left-hand column, go down to Developer Settings here. And then you get to this GitHub Apps page. And what we're just going to do for now is open a new GitHub app. Ooh. I have not logged in this morning, so it's going to make me confirm. No one password. All right. So now we get to this register a new GitHub app page. I'll pause for a second to make sure everybody has caught up. But again, the 3 tabs I have open are a Universe Workshop repository. I have my repository open that I'm going to be using, and this new app page. Moderator, are we good to keep moving on? Awesome, getting a thumbs up. So if you've never made a GitHub app before, this page may look a little overwhelming. There are a lot of settings on here when you keep scrolling, but don't worry, we'll be going over every step today. The first thing we're going to do is build a GitHub app. I'm going to call this Octopup Presentation App. Octopup is my username on this account, and it's useful to add this to your app name during development because these names have to be unique across GitHub, and that's one way to be more sure that that'll be happening. This next little box is just a description to tell users what your GitHub app will be, and is very useful in production, but we're going to be skipping it for now as we're keeping our app in development mode. For this homepage URL, I'm actually going to go over to the first tab we have, our workshop repository, and just copy that link. This is because this link kind of tells users why we're building this app. We're following along with this workshop, and so it's a good URL to have right now. If we keep scrolling, these next couple of sections are going to be URLs that we're not going to be using today, but I'll still give a brief overview of what they are so you know how to use them for future apps. This first one is the user authorization callback URL, and is for user to server flows, but it's for that first traditional workflow that we were mentioning. So after the app is authorized, it'll be redirected back to this URL. As we'll be using the device flow today, we won't be needing this. So we can uncheck this expire user authorization token and keep going. This next URL is for post installation. So instead of after authorizing your app, this is after you install the GitHub app, in case you want your user to complete additional setup. Again, it won't be something we're using today, so we can keep going. This last URL, the webhook URL, is one of my favorite features of GitHub apps and one I've used several times. If you can listen to anything on GitHub, anytime an issue is created, pull requests are open, labels are added, any of those events, you can be sent to your app through this URL. Still, it won't be something we're using today, so you want to uncheck this active checkbox so that this hook is not triggered. If we scroll a little bit more, we get to the permissions section. This first one is repository permissions. And if we scroll a little more, we also see organization permissions here. And then we also see user permissions. These are 3 of our permission categories. I mean, you can see that there's a lot of different permissions underneath these because we want these permissions to be as fine-grained as possible. So when users install your app, they know exactly what the app has access to. Today, we'll be creating an issue. So underneath repository permissions, we want to scroll down to issues. And we want to change this access level over to read and write so that we can also create issues on a repository. If you notice, this actually gave us a mandatory metadata permission here. This gives you basic repository information that's super good for any repository permissions you have, which is why it's a mandatory permission and of anything within this category. So to reiterate, we have read and write access on issues, which gives us read-only on metadata. These are actually the only two permissions we need today for our app. And so we can scroll down and scroll past everything else. Even though these are all great things to keep in mind for future apps. This brings us to our last question. Where can this GitHub app be installed? I'm going to leave it on only on this account because I don't particularly need anyone else installing my app yet. Don't need anyone else using it for themselves. And so it's fine to be only on this account. Again, any of these settings can be changed at any point after you create the app. These will always be here to change. But before I move on and actually create this app, are there any questions? Has everyone followed along? Looks like we're good. So let's go ahead and create this GitHub app. Clicking on that button, I got a registration successful, which is fantastic. So the last thing I'm going to do for this setup is install the app. Going over to this third row in this column, installing an app, clicking that big green install button on my account, Octopub. I'm going to select only select repositories, and then select that one repository I mentioned earlier and that I have open, octopub/arepo. And here you can see with this installation, we have read access to metadata and read and write access to issues, which are the permissions we set specifically for this app. With that, I can hit this big green install button, and we have installed our app. With that, I will be passing it over to Jake, but let the moderator know if there are any questions as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Heather. Moderator, do we have any questions before we move on? Looks like we're good. Awesome. I will share my screen. And I should be on hopefully the same page that Heather left you all off on, except using our new dark mode. So from here, I'm going to take you all through getting started with code spaces, and we'll start getting that our work environment set up. So the first thing that I'm going to do is hop over to our universe repo. That's the GitHub Universe Workshop / GitHub App Device Flow. And going to click on this big green code button. And underneath that, if you've signed up with the Codespaces beta, you should see this open with Codespaces. Or if you're working locally, you can click to copy the clone URL if you haven't already. Got this running locally. And I'm going to go ahead and click, since I'm using Codespaces, I'm going to click open with Codespaces and create a new Codespace. Before I do that, I'm actually going to copy the URL because I'll need to get back to this page after following this link. So new Codespace, and this should start setting up a Codespace for me. And I'm going to pop this window out into a new window because I want to be able to reference some of our documentation while we go. And I'm going to just do a little bit of window tidying real quick while our code space is running. And the other thing that I'm going to do, like I said, I'm going to go back to our workshop repo. And I want to leave this open. If you've read through the README, there's some really helpful links down here for our docs, and we're actually going to be following the device flow docs pretty closely. So I'm going to pop that open so I have it to reference while we're doing this workshop, and just sort of waiting for the code space to initialize. If you haven't read through these docs, they are really well put together. They outline all of the steps. Everything that we've gone over in this presentation is here for you to follow along with, including if you're looking to set up the traditional web OAuth flow as well. We've got that. And our new doc site, I'm pretty happy with it, or at least it's still new to me. I'm still getting used to it, but it's pretty great. While that's still initializing, I think Heather left our installation off on the installation settings page, and we're going to need a value off of the app settings. So I can't see that full with this window size. I've made it big so you all can read it, but I'll make the window a little bigger for me to navigate. So if you're on this page, I'm using my test account, which is Evil Jake. And if you're on the app installation settings, we want to go back to the app settings page so that we can copy a value out of that. And I also have not logged in, so I'm getting prompted with this sudo access. I'm going to get logged in real quick. Oh, right. I'm using my alter ego. Hopefully this is giving everyone a nice little break to get signed up for Codespace's beta and get opted in if they haven't already. But with all of the sudo prompts, I've gotten back to the app settings page instead of the app installation settings page. Since this is taking a little bit longer, I'm going to go see if opening it in a new tab works. Nope. Getting the same results. This is, we did several run-throughs of this workshop to get ready for it, and this is the longest it's ever taken. So we ran out of luck with the demo gods. To keep moving things along, I can't decide. Moderator, what do you think? Should we switch over to developing locally, or should we continue here?
I think we can switch to developing locally, and then we can catch up if possible.
All right. So I'm going to go back through some of the steps that I just covered to get this set up locally. I'm going to, instead of going and opening a code space, I'm going to clone this by copying the URL. Just so I make sure I have a, oh, that's not, of course I have a temp. Git clone the URL and cd into that folder. And awesome, I have a workspace ready. And moderator, since this is the demo font, is that legible to everyone?
Looks awesome. Thank you for checking.
Yeah. Cool. And so the next thing that we need to do to proceed, we've got the help docs open, and we're starting with a blank slate for this workshop. So the first thing I need to do is create a file for us to code out of. So I'm going to touch workshop. And we do want to call it workshop. We have a handful of scripts that can help you out if you get stuck along the way. The diff checkpoint, checkout checkpoint, and those all depend on the file being called workshop. So I have a file called workshop. The next thing I want to do is make it an executable file because we're going to be writing a CLI here. So I'm going to run a command called chmod with the flag +x, which is just setting the executable bit for this file, and then pass it the file name, which is workshop. So chmod +x workshop. And if I ls again, in my terminal at least, that changes the colors of it so that it's a demonstrating it's an executable file. And I need to, actually, another bit of housekeeping, since I'm switching over, I need to create a tmux session so that I can do a split screen. Cool. So I'm going to open that workshop file here, and I'm going to use Vim, and you can use whatever editor you want. Hopefully you're using code spaces because it works better for you. And what I want to add is, now that I've made it a file, made it executable, I want to tell my shell or whatever how to execute this file. So I'm going to add a shebang line that's user bin env. I'm going to use Ruby. You should too, because that's what we're coding in. And now that I have that, I'm going to start this project the way every good project should start, with hello world. So puts hello world, and then that should work. The hello world example is great for finding any bugs in our setup. So I'm going to just run that file. Awesome. I see the hello world message. If you don't see that, hit up our moderators. They might be able to help troubleshoot your setup a little bit. And so with that, we have one other bit of housekeeping. Like I said, we have scripts to help you like stay with us during this presentation if you fall behind. And those depend on us having our environment set up. So I'm going to create another file that's .env by however you want to create a new file. I'm going to touch it and then open it in Vim. And I need two things in here. The first thing I'm going to need is this client ID from the app settings page. This is why I had us all go back here. So we're just going to copy the client ID from the app settings page. And I'm going to add it to this file with the line export client underscore ID, all caps, equal to that client ID value. And I need one other variable in here. We're going to set an environment variable called repo, and we're going to set it to the name with owner string of the repo that we're using to test with. So I have a repo, Vigilant Robot, and I want to copy my username and that repo name and paste that over here so that repo environment variable is equal to eviljake/Vigilant Robot. And with that saved, so export both of those environment variables. I'm going to source that into my shell so that I have them available for the script to run. And if I echo that, I should see that it's set. Awesome. And I think that's all of the housekeeping I have. I'll check in with the moderator about any questions before passing it back over to Heather to get started.
Awesome. It looks like we are good. So Jake has been mentioning a couple of the scripts that we have to follow along. And I'm going to use one now. Script, oops, cannot type, checkout checkpoint, and I'm going to check out checkpoint 0. Now, when I open that workshop file, I'm exactly to where Jake just left off, which will be super helpful and something we will be using as we go back and forth. So now, we don't want to just say puts hello. We want to put something useful for the user to know what the script does. And so what we'll be building today is we have, we want to authenticate with this OAuth device flow that we've mentioned several times now. So that would be some kind of login method. We'll want to use this authorization to create an issue on GitHub. So we want some create issue method And then we can change this usage into a help method. So this puts can look something like usage, workshop, the name of the script, and then these methods that we will be making today: login, create issue, and help. Awesome. Now I'm going to wrap this in a method as we start building up this file. This will be useful. And now we need a way to call this method. And so we're going to pass the arguments from the command line in a case statement. So we can pass the that first subcommand. And when we pass in a string like help to the script, we can call this help method. Now for the else case, we actually kind of want to call the help method too. It's a little redundant in this case, but as we add more methods, this will make more sense. Now that we have this method and a way to call it, when we run workshop, we can pass in help and get that usage method right there. Of course, without this argument, we still get that, but we will be building on this as we go. And with that, that was a quick checkpoint, but this should be the end of the next checkpoint. And so I will check for questions, but then pass it back over to Jake. Looks like we are good.
Cool. Thanks, Heather. I will share my screen. And I want to get caught up to where you were. So I'm going to use the script checkout checkpoint of 1. And checkout checkpoint 1 of 8. I should be here, and I'm going to just run my script to make sure it's working. Awesome. And I forgot to do a setup here. I was trying to troubleshoot my code spaces issue. So the next thing that we want to do with our script is we want to start this login flow that we've seen. And I should have the docs open for this. Yeah, we have 3 steps outlined here in this device flow, and we're going to be following the documentation here pretty precisely. So the first thing to get started with this login is I'm going to define another case called login, and inside that clause, I'm just going to call a method called login. And the next thing I need to do is define that method. So I'm going to go up above and define login. And step 1 here is we need to make that request to GitHub. So we're going to be making an HTTP request, and we didn't want to introduce any dependencies or have any issues there. So we're going to stick with standard library, but I still need to require a couple of files here. So up at the top of the file, I'm going to require net HTTP. And also I'm going to require URI, because we're going to be building up some URLs with it. Awesome. So now that I have that, I am going to, what am I going to do? While I'm up here at the top of the file, I'm going to set a constant. This first request, like we saw in the demo, needs the client ID. So I'm going to define a constant up here. With our .env file, we exported that value to our environment. So I'm going to use env.fetch to get that out. And so the all caps client ID equals env.fetch client ID, so that we have that available. That's it for the top of the file. I'm going to go back down to our login method and set up that URI. And so I'm going to make a variable called entry URI equals, I need to turn on wrap. URI, and I'm just going to take this and paste it from the doc. So we have under step 1 the full URI that we'll need. login device code. I'm going to paste it there. And that's it for the URI. This URI method with all caps and parentheses is just a shortcut that Ruby provides for basically calling URI.new with that variable or with that string value. The next thing that I need is the entry params. So I'm going to start another variable called entry params. And we're going to have to, because we're using standard library and not any helpful gems that would do this for us, we're going to have to encode it ourselves. So I'm going to set that variable to URI.encode www form, which will just take it and use the URI encoding. So the client ID underscore equal. We could skip this step, but we'll go ahead and do it for clarity here. We're going to be using the same method later. And we want to set client ID in these params equal to our constant that we set up above of client ID. Those will be the only params that we'll need for this first request. And the next thing we're going to set is some headers. This isn't strictly required for the OAuth device flow, but we're going to send an accept header of application JSON because we're going to be working with this response value, and it's easier for us to work with JSON. And since we're going to be requesting JSON, we're going to need something to parse it. So I'm going to hop back up to the top of the file again and require the JSON library. And with that, we have everything that we need to make this request. So I'm going to assign another variable to HTTP result. And I want to set that to the return value of a net HTTP post request just by net HTTP.post and pass in the three things that we just set up. So entry URI, entry params, and headers. Those are the three things we need, and that should be good to go. And the Ruby standard library net HTTP parses these responses into different classes. So we're going to use that to do a little bit of error handling here. And we're going to set our response to another case statement based off of HTTP result. And when we get a successful response from HTTP.post, it'll be a class of net HTTP OK. And in the HTTP OK clause, what we want to do is just parse the JSON that will be in the response, the result body. So JSON.parse net HTTP result .body will set the value of the response variable to a hash with that JSON. And then we don't really expect, there aren't any really known failure scenarios to this endpoint. So if we've gotten here, it's truly unexpected. So I'm just going to call an else. And in that case, I'm going to give us some helpful debug by putting HTTP result, which will tell us the class, which is usually just the response code. And then also the body of that so that we can take a peek at that. And then I want to exit one because there's not really anything else that we can do here. So that is it for our case statement. So I want to put a response and see what we got. And I think that should run. So I'm going to go ahead and hop down and test it. And /workshop login is the name of the subcommand. And awesome, that's working. I have my device code and my user code that we saw in the demo before. And unless there are any questions from the moderator, I will hand it over to Heather.
If people are having debugging issues with this change, do you have any suggestions on how to check the difference?
Awesome. Yeah, I was just remembering to mention that. If you are close and you're getting syntax errors or something like that, so for instance, I will just delete some of this code. If you want to, you can run script diff checkpoint, and the name of this checkpoint is checkpoint 2 that we've been working on. And this will show you the diff of what you have versus what our expected checkpoint is. Looks like I got some things out of order at the top, but otherwise it shows that I'm missing this else clause. And that can be helpful if you don't want to lose your work and you want to know what you missed. But also, I think Heather is also going to show the checkout checkpoint if you want to just proceed along.
Yeah, so I can show that checkpoint right now since I will be doing it. We have script. I will check out checkpoint 2 since that's where Jake just left off. And you can also see this is checkpoint 2 of 8 checkpoints we have today. Now when I reload my file, I get caught up to where Jake has been. And this is a little redundant for this point, but since we just talked about diff checkpoint, you can also see that when it prints out nothing, it means you are at the right place. So with that, I will keep going, assuming we have a thumbs up from the moderator. Awesome. And so I have these device flow docs open as well. And if we have now done step 1. And so now if we scroll down to step 2, we will now be prompting the user to enter the code in a browser. Actually, the first thing I'm going to do before that is run this as well to make sure it works for me. All right. Associate environment variables, and now we see that it also works. We have the device code, user code, and all the things we will be needing in just a second. So instead of this response, we want to make it a little nicer for a user, and we want to print out this URL and the device code that they would need to enter here. Hopefully this isn't too hard to see. This user code will be right here, and this verification URI is the URL that we want to print for our user. So for starting step 2, we will say something like, please visit this verification URI from this code. And then we want to put the user code that the user needs to enter there. So, and enter code, let's say, response, user code. Now we have something like that. And if we run the workshop, ooh, yes, I did not say verification URI. My bad. And now we get this URL to make it easy for the user to click on and know where to go. And we just want to enter this code here. And it brings us to this authorization page. And we can go in and click this authorizing our app, and it tells us we are all set. But we haven't yet programmed our code to know when this happens, which will bring us to step 3 of the device flow doc. App pulls GitHub to check if the user has authorized the device. But this actually brings us to the end of the next checkpoint. And so script, check out checkpoint 3. We'll be where we are right now. And so I can pause for a second to make sure everybody is caught up, but then we will keep on going to checkpoint 3. And we have a thumbs up from the moderator. so let's continue going on. So again, we have another post request that we will be needing to make, similar to step 1, where we made this entry URI, entry params setup. We'll be doing something very similar, just for the polling. And so the first thing we're going to do is set it up in a similar way. We have poll URI, and we want that URI to just be this link that you can copy straight from the docs. Login OAuth access token. The next thing we have are the poll params. And we can again do something like URI.encode www form. We also want client ID, which will be the same as before. But here you see we actually have a couple more required params, device code and grant type. And so we're actually going to go back and make this a multi-line hash to make it easier to read. Let's add a little column. There we go. And so now the next required param is device code. And it says the device verification code is what you received from that first post request. So if we scroll up a little bit and see that output we had from before, device code is the very first response we got in that payload. And so here we want to do something like device code is going to be response device code. Awesome. And now this last one is grant type. This grant type is required, but it must be this long fun string. May seem a little odd, but we built this device flow to the IETF spec, and this was part of the spec, and so we kept it in to be consistent and say we wrote it to the spec. So grant type is going to be this string that you can just copy and paste on in. With that, I also need to close this ending parentheses, but those will be all poll params. Now the headers can actually be the same from the first request we did, but there's one more thing I want to do. Since this is a polling request, we want to continually hit this endpoint until we get the authorization notice. And so to be able to poll consistently, we're going to have an interval. And again, this is something that we actually got from the response, from that initial response. We have interval is 5, which stands for 5 seconds. And this means that we are going to poll this endpoint every 5 seconds. So let's set a variable equal to that interval. And now we have everything set up to do all requests. Since we will be polling consistently, we're going to wrap this in a little loop. And we're going to break at the end of the loop. And the first thing we're going to do is make this poll result be another net HTTP request, passing in all of the variables we just did. Poll URI, poll params, and then the headers, which are the same as the first post request we did. Awesome. I'm going to pause here for a second because that's been a little bit of typing, and the next thing we're going to be doing will be a bit of rearranging. I'll wait, see if there are any questions. I'm getting a thumbs up from the moderator, so I hope everyone has been following along. But yes, so the next thing we're going to be doing after this poll result, we want to do the same thing that we did before. If you scroll up, we had this case statement on HTTP result. And we just want to check if it was a successful request. And so we want to do the exact same thing. We want to do this entire case statement pretty much exactly. And one of coding best practices is we don't really want to duplicate code. So this is going to be time to refactor. So I'm going to scroll up to the top of my file. And right above login, I'm going to make a new method called definition post response. And I'm going to pass in this HTTP result because I really want this case statement to be able to say exactly the same. So now we have a new method, something like that. And I really want this exact thing. And so I'm going to copy this and move it up here right into that method. I hope that was easy to see. We're just copying this case statement up here and moving it into a new method so that we can use it. If you're not familiar with Ruby, we return the last thing. So we're automatically returning this JSON pulse of the result body, and it'll exit otherwise. So now that we have this method, we can scroll back down to this first response we did in step 1. And we can change this entire case statement to just call our new method. So we can post response of HTTP result. Now we have something like this. I will put all of that on the screen to make sure you can see it. We have this new method here. Ooh, did not mean to delete that. This new method here, post response. And then we change this line. I'll wait for a thumbs up from the moderator because I will be scrolling back to the bottom of my screen. And I want to give everyone enough time to be able to see this. There will be a checkpoint in just a few minutes. So don't worry about that. But I think it's good to scroll to the bottom of my screen. Back to the bottom of my screen, we have this loop and this other pull request, this post request that we need to now handle. So now we're going to use a method we just made. And so pull response will equal post response of our pull result now. And then I'm just going to put what we get from that to see what it looks like. Now when I do workshop login, we get these, this nice visit and enter code. Then we get this error authorization pending. This actually makes sense because I have yet to go to this URL and enter this code. And so on this first loop, this makes perfect sense. And with that, we are at the end of the next checkpoint, I believe checkpoint 4. And with that, I will be passing it back to Jake, so you all know how to handle these errors and finish our polls.
Cool. Thanks, Heather. I will go ahead and share my screen and catch up. So the first thing that I want to do here is catch up with you. So I'm going to script checkout checkpoint 4, which should catch me up, and reload my file. This looks the same, and I will run it with workshop login. Awesome. Authorization pending. And so this thumbs up, we're good to go. I'm going to keep moving along. We're in step 3 of the docs. And if we look at the response codes, we also have these error codes for the device flow. And they're error codes, but several of them are not exceptional because we sort of expect to get them. And the first one that we, obviously we're seeing it repeatedly, so we should expect to receive it, is this authorization pending, which, as we've said, is just the user hasn't entered the code into GitHub. So I'm going to start another case statement here for handling a handful. We're not going to handle all of them, but we will handle a couple of them that are sort of required by this device flow. So I'm going to do, if we find an error in the pull response, I'm going to enter into an if statement. So I'm just going to do if pull response.key error. So if that JSON hash has the key error, we'll enter this if. And to handle the different conditions that we might have, I'm going to start another case statement based on the value of this error key. So case pull response error. And the first clause that we want is authorization pending. And if the user hasn't entered the code into GitHub, all we really want to do is give them a chance to do that. So we're going to sleep the interval, which we received from GitHub in our initial request, which defaults to 5 seconds. And we just want to, give some breathing room. We don't want to be hitting this endpoint too fast. So we're going to sleep for 5 seconds, and then I'm going to call next just to proceed through the next iteration of this loop. Speaking of hitting this endpoint too fast, if we are hitting this endpoint too fast, we'll get this next error code, which is slow down. And this just says, for whatever reason, this endpoint you've been requesting it too often, too quickly. We need you to slow down. And so in this scenario, GitHub actually sends the interval that you should sleep. So I'm going to update the value of our interval variable to be the pull response interval value. So interval equals pull response brackets interval. And then I'm going to wait for that amount of time by sleeping for interval and call next to proceed through the next iteration of this loop. And those are the only two error codes that we're sort of required to implement. We can see that we have several more that would be a good idea to implement if we're implementing a device flow client. But for the purposes of our workshop today, we're going to skip those. And we're just going to define an else clause here that breaks us out of this loop if we get that. So I'm going to say else puts the pull response so that we get some debugging information, and exit 1 for an unsuccessful command, which will break us out of this loop, break the cycle, and we'll get to deal with that. So that's it for the error handling that we have. If we don't get a pull response error, we've got an access token. So we can see in the docs that if there's no error, we've successfully completed this flow. And just because we've got code that works, I want to run it. So I'm just going to put this value of pull response access token and run it, because this is our first successful trip through the device flow with our workshop code. So we can see here that it prompts me with the link. As we've seen, I'm going to copy my code, enter it in, authorize the app, and I should see a code printed out. Perfect. That worked. We've successfully gone through it. But we don't really want to be, that's not what we want to do. We want to store this token somewhere. So that was just a fun, like, your code works, huzzah. If you didn't get that, remember you can diff the checkpoint to see what's missing, but we do have a handful, a couple more things we need to do before this checkpoint wraps. So what we want to do, instead of writing that to standard out, is we want to write this to a file. Usually you'd want to store this somewhere a little bit more secure than just a file, maybe a file in the user's home directory, or using the OS provided keychain tools. But to keep this all local and easily removable, we're just going to write it to a hidden file inside this folder. So I'm going to call file.write pull response access token. And that will write it to a file, but just because this is, like we've said before, this is a token that you can use throughout our APIs. I'm going to change the permissions. The default file permissions for that are readable by everyone. So I'm going to change that to readable only by the user by calling fileutils.chmod /.token. Just a little nod to security here. If you're shipping this to somewhere, I think, follow the best practices for wherever you're shipping it to for how to secure this. So with the file utils mod, that doesn't actually come preloaded. So I'm going to need to hop back to the top of the file and require file utils to be able to change the permissions of that file. So up at the top, require file utils, and then back down to the body of our loop. The last thing that we want to do is let the user know that we have successfully authenticated, which, right, I have to, actually, I'm going to put you've authenticated here. Usually I have a little party emoji, but my terminal doesn't support the emoji picker, so we'll get that with the checkpoint. So I'm going to rerun that just to make sure I didn't introduce any errors, and enter my code again. And I'm all set. And I get the happy message, you've authenticated. And if I look in my workshop folder, I see that I have a file .token, and that the permissions are read write for myself only. And that's what we want, which I believe takes us to the end of checkpoint 5 of 8.
I believe so. I will share my screen as we wait for any questions to come in. We'll also check out checkpoint. That was 5. Reload. And it looks like I am up to the same place. I have the little emoji now. And I run workshop login, because I also need to get a token to be able to do our next bit. Authorizing my app, and I do get an authenticated message. Fantastic. Moderator, are we good to keep going? Fantastic. So the next thing we're going to do is, now that we're done authorizing via the OAuth flow, I'm going to go back and switch over to the GitHub docs for the issues API. Because the next thing I'm going to be doing is creating an issue with this token on GitHub. And so here are the API docs for that, creating an issue. And going back to the code, the first thing I'm going to need to do is add this to our case statement. When we pass in something like create issue, we're going to call this new method that we are about to create. That method will go by the same name, create issue. And now we have that skeleton lined out. So if you notice here, this is actually going to be another post request, as we've been doing multiple times in this workshop, and there are several parameters that we can pass in.
I think real quick, before you move from this, I think on line 84, you want an underscore instead of a hyphen.
You are 100% correct. That would become a problem. Thank you, Jake. So we're going to set up this create issue in the same way we've been creating all of our post requests. We're going to start with the UI. For the REST API at GitHub, this link will be https://api.github.com. And then we follow this path, which is repos. And then we want this owner repo variables, followed by issues. So the owner repo, we actually put an environment variable back in the very beginning. And we don't have it as a constant yet, but we will do that next. For now, I'm just going to add it here as if we had it and finish that path, add issues. But now we need to go add this constant repo. So I'm going to scroll back to the top of my file. And right underneath this client ID constant, we are going to add our repo constant. In the same way, fetching it from our environment. Awesome. So now we just have this new line here, repo fetched from the environment. And I'm going to scroll back to the bottom of my screen, bottom of the file. And now this constant, we'll populate this with what we want it to be. Next, we're going to do the params. And this is going to be another multi-line thing because there's several params that we can add here. Here, the only one that is required is the title of the issue. And so for that, we can add title. Let's do something like success. That was a lot of S's. I have authenticated with device flow. Because if this becomes a successful API request, it means we have correctly authenticated with that token that we made via the device flow. So with that, let's add a little comma. So what other params do we want to add? Body is a pretty good one for issues. It's the content of the issue. So let's add that. And it's just going to be, let's add some more emojis. We have ta-da and partying face, are two of my favorite celebratory ones. And if you're not familiar with emojis on GitHub, if you wrap words within these little colons, it'll convert them to emojis on GitHub. Awesome. And so the next thing we have is we want to change these to JSON so they are properly encoded. And I think that'll be enough for params for now. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to do our headers. We're actually going to have a couple more headers this time, but we can start with the except. Instead of using application JSON this time, we're actually going to use this application B&D GitHub v3. It's recommended for GitHub's REST API. So we can just follow that by copying it in. The next thing we're going to do is the authorization. The star of this show, basically. With that, we add token. And then we need to read it from this file that we saved it in, this hidden token file. And to do that, we can call file.read and then pass in the path to that hidden file. Fantastic. The last thing we're going to do for these headers before we move on is just add a user agent. That feels like the wrong highlighting. Yes, I missed a little ending bracket here. Okay. Yeah, that's better. Highlighting. And for this highlighting, for this user agent header, we're just going to say something like GitHub apps 2020 universe, so we can see how it's going at our wonderful workshop. So those are all of the variables we are going to be doing right now before we create the request. And this actually is the end of checkpoint 6. So if you want to do script, check out checkpoint 6 to get caught up to this far. You are welcome to. But I'm not going to because I have made it here myself. And that we're going to keep on going, I think. And the next thing to do is to make these requests. And so like we usually do, we're going to say set the result equal to the net HTTP and call this post by passing in all of these variables we made: issue URI, params, and headers. Awesome. And then we're going to set the response to the method we have, pass response of result. However, one thing to note is with this response, we actually get a status 201 created because we are making something on GitHub. So in that case, we actually have to scroll back to our pass response method. So scrolling back to the top of my file. And up here, instead of having just this net HTTP OK, we also need to add net HTTP created. Because this is also successful as status code, and we want that to be caught and parsed as well. So after adding net HTTP created up here, I'm going to scroll back to the bottom of my file. The last thing I'm going to do is just put the response that we get, like we often do. And now I can call this method, call create issue. Why am I trying to autocomplete? And we get this nice, long, complicated payload, which makes sense because that's also what we see in this response. But to make this a little easier to look at, we're just going to add a tJSON on that response. And type this with JQ. Let me clear this so you can see that. We have bookshop, create issue, type it into JQ. And we can see this nicely printed response. We see some things like performed via GitHub app. We see this body is our beautiful issues. And if I go over to my repo, it does look like we saw this, which is fantastic. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to Jake for the last stretch.
Awesome. Thanks, Heather. I will share my screen as I catch up and ask the moderator if we have any questions.
This is also the end of the next checkpoint. It's checkpoint 7. I did not say that.
Looks like we're good on questions, so I will check out checkpoint 7 and catch up to where Heather is, which we are, checkpoint 8 is a very small checkpoint. The only thing we really need to do, because we have successfully authenticated with device flow, and we've sort of proven ourselves by creating an issue. We were authenticating with the GitHub API. I'm going to run it just to make sure I also get a successful response. Looks like we're good to go. We just want to make this response a little bit friendlier. So we're, instead of putting displaying all of the JSON, we are going to just put a helpful, friendly little message here of you can visit your issue here. And the response JSON has the HTML URL of the issue we just created. So we're going to print that out so that the user can just click it from their terminal and open it in their browser. That is the last bit of code for this. Let's just make sure that looks good here. Awesome. I also get some party emoji. And we can see, as we saw in the slides earlier, I have an issue opened. You can see that I opened it as my user via this app that I've created. So we're using the user to server auth that we talked about earlier. And it looks like it's working well. So like I said, that's the end of the coding portion of our presentation. I don't think that we have anything else for that. I do want to quickly walk you through one last bit of housekeeping and just show you all, since we have made a demo app and we have written tokens to your computer, I want to show you how to deauthorize those just to close up any lingering security holes or that we might have had. So if you click on your profile badge and go to settings, and then scroll down to applications, which is the last in the main navigation bar on the left, you can go ahead and under Authorize GitHub Apps, you can revoke the permission for our presentation app. And if you do that, the token that you've created is no longer valid. If I try to create another issue, I get a bad credentials. Obviously, demonstrating our good error handling there, that we see we've got invalid credentials. If you want to reauthorize, you can walk through the device flow again. But just so we don't leave you in an insecure state, I wanted to show that to you. And I think that's a wrap, unless we have any questions.
Looks like we don't have any other questions. Thank you so much, speakers, for this presentation.
Thank you all
Yeah.
for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining. And thank you, moderators, for helping everything flow so smoothly this morning.
Awesome. Bye, everyone.